What if I told you that the greatest threat to your freedom isn't evil? It's not corruption, not violence, not ignorance. According to one man, a theologian who stood against the Nazis and paid with his life, the real danger is something much more subtle, much more contagious, and much more terrifying. Stupidity. Not the kind you laugh at on the internet. Not the clumsy, goofy, harmless kind. But a deeper force. A moral blindness that spreads through society like a virus, wearing the face of loyalty, faith, even goodness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't just call it out, he dissected it. And what he found was chilling. Stupidity isn't a lack of intelligence, it's the surrender of thought. And once it takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to break. In this video we're going to unpack the disturbing brilliance of Bonhoeffer's forgotten theory. We'll explore how smart people become tools of destruction, how crowds make us dumber, why you can't argue with stupidity, and most importantly how to resist it. Because once you understand what Bonhoeffer saw, you won't look at the world, or yourself, the same way again. So don't just watch. Wake up. And stay until the end. It's easy to look back at history and assume we'd have done better. That we would have seen the signs, asked the right questions, or refused to follow the crowd. But what if you were living in a time when everything around you, your neighbors, your leaders, your culture, was falling under a silent hypnosis? That's exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer witnessed. A theologian and philosopher, he saw something more terrifying than brutality. He saw something disturbingly empty, stupidity in action, clothed in certainty and nationalism. Imagine this. Germany, once a hub of philosophy, science, and high art, was slowly becoming a place where critical thought was replaced by slogans, where obedience was praised above all, and where good people stopped thinking for themselves. Bonhoeffer, surrounded by silence and compliance, asked a chilling question. What if stupidity is more dangerous than evil? Evil, he thought, you could confront. But stupidity? It just smiled and kept marching. This wasn't ignorance, it was a surrender of thought. Bonhoeffer wasn't throwing around insults. He wasn't mocking the uneducated or calling people dumb. His theory of dangerous stupidity wasn't about IQ, it was about moral sleepwalking. He noticed that when people stopped thinking for themselves, they became instruments of destruction without even knowing it. They laughed at cruelty, cheered at injustice, and justified what they once feared. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary. And that's what terrified him the most. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because this wasn't just about 1930s Germany. Bonhoeffer was pointing at something deeper, something timeless. The way collective mindlessness creeps into culture, cloaked in flags, faith, and authority. He was watching a society trade its soul for a sense of belonging. But why? Why would a person give up their most precious power, the ability to think, without even noticing? Bonhoeffer didn't come up with his theory of stupidity in a library. It wasn't the product of academic debate or detached observation. No, it was born in the fire of lived experience. As Hitler rose to power, Bonhoeffer watched his fellow citizens, people he respected, people he loved, fall in line not out of hatred but out of thoughtlessness. They weren't asking, is this right? They were asking, is this allowed? And that subtle shift, he realized, was the seed of destruction. This idea haunted him, that evil didn't need villains, it only needed the unaware. In his prison writings, Bonhoeffer began to shape the insight that would later disturb the world. He described stupidity not as a lack of intelligence, but as a kind of infection, a willing blindness that spreads when people stop questioning authority, when they trade their conscience for convenience. The terrifying part? Once infected, the stupid person often feels proud, confident, even righteous. Bonhoeffer noticed something deeply ironic. The more powerless a person feels, the more likely they are to submit their thinking to someone else. In chaotic times, stupidity thrives not because people are evil but because they're overwhelmed. They're looking for certainty, not truth. For direction, not understanding. So they outsource their mind, to propaganda, to peer pressure, to charismatic leaders who promise simple answers to complex problems. That's when stupidity becomes organized. That's when it becomes dangerous. What makes this theory even more chilling is its humility. Bonhoeffer wasn't saying they are stupid. He was warning, any of us can be. This wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. A call to vigilance. Because once stupidity takes root, it's not just a personal flaw, it becomes a social force. And once that force begins to grow, something very strange happens next. Here's where Bonhoeffer flipped the table. Most of us think of stupidity as a problem of low intelligence, a lack of education, bad reasoning, or simply not being smart. But Bonhoeffer saw it differently. To him, stupidity was a failure of character, not of intellect. He had met professors who were functionally blind to truth, and simple workers who saw the world with stunning clarity. The difference wasn't IQ, it was courage. See, to think clearly takes more than brainpower. It takes moral responsibility. It takes the willingness to question what everyone else is swallowing whole. But that kind of clarity can be uncomfortable. Can cost friendships, jobs, even your safety. So instead, many choose the path of least resistance. They conform. They blend in. They nod along not because they believe but because it's easier. Bonhoeffer knew, stupidity is comfortable, and that's what makes it so lethal. When someone chooses not to think, they aren't just making a private decision. They're removing themselves from the moral conversation. They become a tool, a repeater of ideas they never tested. And the tragedy is, they often feel virtuous. They follow rules, obey laws, respect authority. But under the surface there's no depth, no inner compass. Bonhoeffer argued that this abdication of thought is itself a form of wrongdoing, even if it wears a smile. And that's why he feared it more than evil. Evil at least stands alone. It knows what it wants. But stupidity, especially the collective kind, moves in crowds. It sings the national anthem. It votes. It shares slogans. It thinks it's doing good. And once that fog sets in, even the brightest minds can get lost in it. So the real question becomes, how do good people fall into this trap? It's tempting to think that intelligence protects us. That being smart, educated, or well-informed keeps us safe from stupidity. But Bonhoeffer knew better. He watched as judges, doctors, scientists, and clergy, the supposed elite of thought, bent the knee to a regime that demanded loyalty over truth. These weren't ignorant people. They were simply unwilling to stand alone. Because in times of fear or social pressure, intellect isn't the first thing to go, it's integrity. You've probably seen this yourself. Maybe it was a brilliant coworker who stayed silent during a moral failure at work. Or a family member who shares misinformation, not out of malice, but because it's what everyone else believes. In these moments, what we call stupidity is really something else. A refusal to think independently. Smart people aren't immune to this. In fact, their intelligence can become a trap. They use it to rationalize, to justify, to build elegant cages around their fear. Bonhoeffer understood this psychological trick. He saw that when people want to fit in, they'll twist their thinking to match the crowd. It's not about logic, it's about belonging. So they start editing reality. They ignore contradictions. They repeat mantras. They perform intellectual gymnastics just to avoid standing out. And in doing so, they trade truth for acceptance. The smarter they are, the better they are at hiding it, even from themselves. This is why stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's view, wasn't just a personal defect. It was a social phenomenon, a virus of the mind that feeds on fear and conformity. And when smart people embrace it, they become its most effective carriers. Not because they're evil, not because they're dumb, but because they've made peace with the fog. Which brings us to a disturbing realization. Sometimes, the smarter the person, the harder they fall. There's something almost magical and terrifying about crowds. Put 100 individuals in a room, each with their own mind, their own doubts, their own convictions, and suddenly those minds begin to dissolve. Not because they were weak, but because the need to belong outweighs the need to be right. Bonhoeffer saw this clearly. When people come together in fear, in crisis, or under a strong leader, they stop thinking and start echoing. This isn't just philosophy. It's psychology. In a crowd, people feel less responsible. The thinking gets outsourced to the group. If we're all doing it, it must be okay. But Bonhoeffer warned, that's exactly how horror becomes normalized. That's how people cheer for violence, laugh at cruelty, or stay silent when others are disappearing. The crowd gives them cover, and in that cover, stupidity thrives. And here's the twist. The more unified the crowd feels, the more dangerous it becomes. Bonhoeffer noted how totalitarian systems feed off this unity. They don't want debate. They don't want nuance. They want loyalty. And loyalty doesn't ask questions. So the individual shrinks. The conscience goes quiet. And suddenly people who were once kind, reflective, even wise, start chanting slogans, saluting flags, and turning away from suffering they would have once opposed. The truly disturbing part? The crowd doesn't just make you act differently, it makes you feel differently. You stop feeling the weight of your choices. You feel safe in the wave. And once that feeling sets in, it takes enormous inner strength to break free. Which is why Bonhoeffer said that stupidity, not evil, was the real threat to the soul of a nation. And yet he didn't give up hope. Because even in a sea of noise, there's one kind of person who can resist it. This is the part that stings. Bonhoeffer believed, and insisted, that you cannot argue someone out of stupidity. Not because they're incapable of understanding, but because they're no longer open to truth. They've stopped listening. They're not in dialogue, they're in performance. And once a person is caught in that mindset, logic becomes useless. You can throw facts, data, even personal stories at them, it all bounces off the surface. It's like trying to wake someone who wants to stay asleep. They're not just uninformed, they're unreachable. Because stupidity, as Bonhoeffer saw it, is not a lack of knowledge, it's a refusal of engagement. It's psychological armor. It protects the person from the discomfort of reality. And here's the cruel irony, the more you push, the more they dig in. Not because you're wrong, but because your presence threatens their illusion. So what do you do when reasoning fails? Bonhoeffer's answer wasn't easy, but it was clear. You resist. Not with violence. Not with shouting. But with presence, clarity, and quiet defiance. You become the kind of person who thinks anyway, who speaks truth anyway, who lives awake, even if the world around you is sleepwalking. It's less about changing others and more about not becoming like them. This is where Bonhoeffer's courage comes into full view. He didn't just talk about resisting stupidity, he lived it. He resisted the Nazi regime with words, with action, with his life. And he knew, resistance often looks small. It looks lonely. But it's not weak. It's the only way the fog ever lifts. And that brings us to a haunting question. What happens when the fog covers everything? You might be thinking, okay, but that was Nazi Germany. That was another era. And you're right, but only on the surface. Bonhoeffer's insight wasn't frozen in time. In fact, it feels more relevant now than ever. Because today, stupidity isn't marching in uniform. It's scrolling, reposting, trending. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles, goes viral, and calls itself influencer. The form changed. The threat didn't. Think about how quickly misinformation spreads online. How effortlessly people repeat headlines without reading articles. How outrage is monetized and complexity is drowned out by memes. Bonhoeffer would have seen this not as a technical problem, but a moral one. We've built tools that amplify the very thing he warned about, collective mindlessness. And the more connected we become, the easier it is to fall into thoughtless conformity disguised as connection. The scary part is today's stupidity often feels harmless, even fun. It's a trending dance, a political slogan, a shared belief that no one wants to challenge. But underneath, the same pattern emerges. People stop thinking for themselves and start mimicking what gets rewarded. They defend ideas they never questioned. They shame others in the name of virtue. And just like that, stupidity becomes a force again, not out of malice but momentum. But Bonhoeffer didn't write this theory so we'd panic. He wrote it so we'd pay attention. So we'd notice when our thinking drifts, when our convictions go quiet, when we start nodding just to fit in. His warning isn't about the past. It's about recognizing the present, and choosing a different path. Because in a world this loud, the real revolution starts quietly. Bonhoeffer didn't just diagnose the disease, he pointed to the cure. And no, it wasn't some grand movement or political solution. It was far more intimate, more difficult, and more radical. The cultivation of inner clarity. In a world spinning with noise, the bravest act is to become quiet enough to hear yourself think. Not your social feed. Not your tribe. Because truth doesn't scream, it whispers. And only the still can hear it. He believed that real resistance starts in solitude. Not isolation, but solitude with purpose. The kind of solitude that allows you to ask dangerous questions. To confront your own compromises. To look at your fears without distraction. Most people avoid this space. It's uncomfortable. But Bonhoeffer knew, without solitude there's no clarity, and without clarity courage is just noise. Real courage comes from alignment, not adrenaline. And here's the beauty, this kind of courage isn't loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a soft no. A refusal to repost. A quiet decision to walk away from the groupthink. Bonhoeffer's own resistance wasn't built in rallies, it was built in prayer, in reflection, in the private battle to stay awake. That's why his voice still matters. Because he reminds us that the strongest people aren't those who shout the most, they're the ones who stand alone when it matters. But let's be real, standing alone is hard. It's lonely. It's risky. And that's why so few people do it. But Bonhoeffer's legacy whispers something powerful. You don't have to be loud to make a difference, you just have to be clear. And when enough clear minds begin to emerge, something remarkable becomes possible. There's a difference between one person acting stupidly and a whole system designed to reward stupidity. That's the nightmare Bonhoeffer foresaw, and lived through. When stupidity becomes institutionalized, it stops looking like folly and starts looking like policy. It wears a suit. It holds press conferences. It runs corporations, schools, churches. And worst of all, feels normal. That's when the danger hits a new level. You can argue with a person. You can't argue with a system that punishes thinking and rewards obedience. Bonhoeffer knew that when institutions start valuing silence over truth, simplicity over nuance, and compliance over courage, stupidity becomes embedded in the culture. People don't just stop thinking, they're trained not to. And over time, questioning becomes deviant. Dissent becomes dangerous. At that point, the fog isn't just around you, it's inside you. This is the point where evil no longer needs to hide. It gets carried out by people who believe they're just doing their job. Processing paperwork. Following orders. Enforcing rules they never wrote and don't question. And because the system protects them from responsibility, they rarely feel the weight of their actions. Bonhoeffer wasn't describing monsters. He was describing bureaucrats. Teachers. Clerks. The terrifying truth? You don't need hatred to build a dystopia, you just need enough people willing to stop thinking. But even here, Bonhoeffer leaves a crack in the wall. Because no system, no matter how powerful, can fully suppress the human soul. There are always outliers. Resistors. People who wake up and refuse to participate. People who choose awareness over compliance. And that's exactly where this theory turns into a challenge. At the end of it all, Bonhoeffer's theory isn't just a warning, it's an invitation. A quiet dare. To live with awareness instead of compliance. To stay mentally awake in a world that seduces you to sleep. It sounds noble, maybe even inspiring, until you realize what it actually costs. Because awareness doesn't come cheap. It means feeling what others ignore. Seeing what others deny. And sometimes standing alone in a room full of nodding heads. To choose awareness is to choose discomfort. It's easier to blend in, to laugh at what others laugh at, to go along with the script. But Bonhoeffer challenges us to notice the script, and rewrite it. It doesn't mean becoming loud or confrontational. It means becoming responsible. For your thoughts. For your words. For the way you move through the world. Because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. And that clarity comes with a price. Integrity. There's power in that though. Because the world doesn't need more noise, it needs more presence. More people who listen deeply, speak carefully, and think for themselves. That's how cultures begin to change. Not through mass movements, but through quiet revolutions in individual hearts. Bonhoeffer's life was proof. Even under the shadow of tyranny, a clear mind can still shine. And that light, subtle as it may be, is contagious. So the question becomes deeply personal. Will you think? Not just for yourself, but for the world around you. Will you resist the fog even when it's warm and familiar? Will you pay attention when it's easier to scroll past? Will you be the person who, in the face of stupidity, chooses courage, clarity, and quiet resistance? Because in the end, that's not just philosophy, that's how freedom survives. So now you've heard it, the theory they never taught you in school. Not because it's too complex, but because it's too confronting. Bonhoeffer didn't whisper warnings from a distance. He lived through stupidity turned systemic, and it cost him everything. Yet even in prison, even in the shadow of death, he held to one truth. Freedom doesn't start with rebellion. It starts with awareness. And now the mirror turns to you. Are you really thinking, or are you just repeating? Are your convictions truly yours, or just inherited noise? When was the last time you stood alone, not to be right but to be real? Because today, stupidity doesn't wear a uniform. It wears comfort. It wears convenience. It wears silence. So here's your challenge. Don't become part of the fog. Resist with your mind. Sharpen your awareness. Think harder even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Because in a world where compliance is rewarded, thoughtfulness is a revolutionary act. And if this message hit something in you, if it stirred a part you've been ignoring, don't let it fade. Leave a comment below and tell me. When did you wake up? What was your turning point? And if you want to keep exploring these uncomfortable truths with me, subscribe to Timeless Advice, hit the bell, and join a community that refuses to go numb. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more of you fully awake.